This is the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. In the fall of 1864, General William T. Sherman led his army through Atlanta, Georgia, blazing a path of destruction as they headed east across the state to Savannah. While the army marched through town after Confederate town, plantation owners fled. But even before they did so, slaves self-emancipated by physically joining the Union lines. By the time the Army seized Savannah in December of that year, as many as 20,000 enslaved people had attached themselves to Sherman's army in the expectation that the company would help free them. Bennett Parten's new book, Somewhere Toward Freedom, is a new breakthrough account that reframes Sherman's March as the largest liberation event in American history. Parton's compelling narrative is the first to focus on the myriad of stories of the enslaved individuals who self-emancipated. It's a journey told through the lens of resilience, hope, and the beginning sparks of Reconstruction. Bennett Parten is an assistant professor of history at Georgia Southern University, whose area of expertise is the Civil War period. He's a native of Royston, Georgia, and completed his PhD in history at Yale University. His writing has appeared in the Washington Post, Los Angeles Review of Books, Zocalo Public Square, and the Civil War Monitor, among others. Currently makes his home in beautiful Savannah, Georgia, where he often encounters reminders of Sherman's March. Happy to have Bennett Parten join me now here on Speaking of Writers. Bennett, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So, why this book for you?
Yeah, so this book started actually by reading a work of fiction. Some of your listeners may be familiar with E.L. Doctorow's work of fiction on Sherman's March called simply The March. And as Doctorow had a habit of doing, he featured in this book a real kaleidoscopic cast of characters. There's a Union surgeon. There are Confederate soldiers. There are Southern white women. The list of characters goes on and on. But one of the characters in the book was a freedwoman named Wilma Jones, who decides to leave everything and follow Sherman's army as it marches through Georgia. So when I was reading this as a young graduate student, it struck me that Jones's character was really a composite character, that her story is one of many thousands. And then I began to think about the ways that we could actually tell this story in full, to try to tell a historical account of the enslavement of women who followed Sherman's march through Georgia. And so that's really where the story begins. It begins by reading a work of fiction. It began with the idea that maybe I could write a kind of nonfiction companion piece or handbook to E.L. Doctorow's great book, The March.
How does your book reimagine the history of Sherman's March?
Well, first of all, it tries to present it as a liberation event or freedom movement. And it tries to understand the march itself as a emancipation event. And I'm able to tell this story in part because, as you mentioned in your opener, by the time Sherman arrives in Savannah, he speculates that as many as 20,000 refugees from slavery are following his army. And just to be clear, those are enslaved people who had done just as Wilma Jones had left everything, left the plantation, and followed the army through the state. Now, that's a pretty large number, I should point out, too. 20,000 is roughly the size of Savannah itself. So this is a refugee movement of a large southern city moving along behind the army. But if I could just point out as well, that 20,000 is really only a fraction of the amount of people who ran to the army and then decided to either turn back or to not follow along. And it's also just a small fraction of the tens of thousands of enslaved people who experienced freedom for the first time in the middle of this event. And so what I try to do in the book is, as I said, I try to reimagine Sherman's March as just such a liberation movement. And I use the refugees as really a window into telling the story and then getting at the much larger story of emancipation as it unfolds in the wake of the army.
What did these refugees, these emancipated slaves, endure during Sherman's March?
Well, they endured incredible hardship. I mean, all the difficulties that would come from making such a march as a soldier, the refugees experienced it as well, except they did so without the security that came from being a soldier. They did so without the security of knowing where the a meal at the end of the day is going to come from. They did so while having oftentimes to dodge Confederate cavalry. And so it was a dangerous, deadly, and incredibly uncertain and unstable experience. It's also worth pointing out that Sherman's army was not necessarily welcoming of the refugees. Some regiments were, some commanders were. Early on in the march, many were, pleased to allow the refugees to follow along. Uh, but there were just as many commanders who were not. And then certainly by the time the march gets closer to Savannah, where there are more rivers, food becomes much more scarce. It becomes much more common for the army to begin turning men and women away. So this entire experience was really a kind of liminal experience. There was so much uncertainty, so many questions. And it was always incredibly dangerous.
When they get to Savannah, you talk about the Port Royal experiment. What was the significance of the Port Royal experiment?
Sure. So the Port Royal experiment is a federal project that takes place on the coast of South Carolina, particularly on the Sea Islands around Beaufort. This is this strip of islands from roughly Savannah in the south up to Edisto in the north, just on the other side of the Savannah River. And what happens early in 1861 is that the U.S. Navy sails into Port Royal Sound, which is the deepest deep water port on the southern coastline. And they want to use Port Royal and then the nearby city of Beaufort as a base of operations to then blockade Charleston and Savannah and patrol the southern coastline. The Navy is successful in taking Port Royal Sound, but then what happens is when the Navy pulls in, many of the, if not, oh, excuse me, I should say all of the local Confederates flee. And in doing so, they leave behind about 10,000 enslaved people there on the islands. And for the government, this is a real question of what to do with these people, because by all intents and purposes, they're free. The slave owners have left, but that's not really how the U.S. government defines them. This is still 1861. This is long before Emancipation Proclamation. This is the early days of the U.S. government trying to figure out what to do about emancipation as this war is unfolding. And so what ends up happening is the government begins a project known as, you mentioned the Port Royal experiment. And what this is a project or a program by which teams of Northern missionaries, superintendents, humanitarian workers, philanthropists come down to the islands. They do things like administer humanitarian aid. Many of the teachers will begin leading schools. They'll hold classrooms. There'll be a number of religious services. But critically, many of those superintendents will work putting enslaved people back to work on the plantations, not as formally as enslaved people, but as free laborers. And this is supposed to be a project or a process that begins to transition the South toward a free labor future. And so Port Royal is itself really important in starting this evolution to emancipation, or at least a more full-throated embrace of emancipation. But it matters in the context of Sherman's march because by the time Sherman arrives at Savannah, he's got 20,000 refugees following him. He begins transporting many of those refugees down the Ogeechee River just south of Savannah, out into the Atlantic, and up into Port Royal. It becomes a kind of haven for these refugees. And in Sherman's mind, this is a place that's as good for them as any. There is support there, there's a structure. There are already refugees from elsewhere in South Carolina who have arrived. The total population of the Port Royal experiment is now about 15,000. That's not counting the roughly 15,000 more enslaved people or formerly enslaved people that are going to arrive. But what happens with Port Royal experiment is when so many new refugees arrive from Georgia, it completely destabilizes the experience. It becomes the site of a humanitarian crisis, a refugee crisis. So many enslaved people who have been marching behind the army for weeks, if not months, who are shorn of any sort of clothing, support, security, right, arrive, and it completely destabilizes the project underway there at Port Royal.
And it was the march a missed opportunity, and if so, why?
Yeah, I present it as a missed opportunity in the book, in part because Sherman's army marches through Georgia. It is the campaign that conquers the Confederacy, so to speak. It is also a campaign that destroys slavery in the state. It's a campaign in which many thousands of enslaved people are going to experience freedom for the first time. And in following the army, in effect, making claims on the army as a representative of the US government, enslaved people began petitioning the government to think longer and harder about what freedom might look like as Reconstruction begins to dawn. And so the march generates incredible momentum when it comes to redefining what freedom might actually look like. But ultimately, I present it as a missed opportunity because this window that's opened by the march narrows very quickly. And it narrows immediately after the war when all of the questions of Reconstruction come to the fore and as Reconstruction ultimately fails. And so, as a sort of early moment of Reconstruction, it is one of incredible opportunity. But as we know from our history, that opportunity closes very quickly.
How do you think Reconstruction would have changed if Lincoln would have lived?
Oh man, that's
Big
one
question.
of the perennial questions. I
Hmm.
mean, you ask some historians, and certainly by Lincoln's own admission, with his 10% program, he approached the South somewhat leniently. His goal was to bring Southerners back into the U.S. government more quickly. He wanted to uh, um, uh, recreate new state governments, put new governments in place in those states. And so there is an argument to be made that Lincoln would have been incredibly lenient on the South and on Southerners. Uh, but on the flip side of that, is I think there's no question that Lincoln would have perhaps done more to embrace racial justice than his successor, Andrew Johnson, did. I mean, already by Lincoln's death, he had become an advocate for black voting. At a time when much of 1865 is going to be taken up with this very question of black suffrage, and the same for 1866. So I think Lincoln would be much more of an advocate for that. And so, despite the signs of Lincoln's leniency that you can see early in the war when he's imagining Reconstruction, I think certainly when it comes to racial justice, he would have been much more of an advocate than someone like Andrew Johnson. So it's a open question. I think you can answer in different ways, and
Hmm.
there's evidence for both approaches.
What was your research like for this book?
Yeah, so the research was difficult in the sense that, as historians of the period will tell you, finding documents written by enslaved people can be really difficult. Finding documents written by formerly enslaved people who experienced freedom in the Civil War can also be difficult. And certainly finding resources of refugees, people who are on the move, makes that task even harder. Uh, but fortunately, um, armies are great bureaucracies. They leave behind copious amounts of documents, reports, things of that nature. And so, on the one hand, I was able to really tap into this story and read out the experiences of enslaved people by reading through the documents left behind by the U.S. Army. On the other hand, many of the soldiers themselves knew that in taking part in the march, they were experiencing one of the great moments in all of American history. That they were doing something that would change the order of history. And if they didn't know that as it was happening, they certainly recognized that 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years after the fact. Um, and over time, many of these soldiers would produce countless numbers of personal histories, recollections, reminiscences. There's a whole genre of regimental histories by which veterans would get together, compile all of their written records, put them all in a book, and call it a regimental history. And these became a real repository of information about the march itself. And we shouldn't be surprised that for many of Sherman's soldiers, many of whom came from places like Indiana, Ohio, and elsewhere, who had never really seen or experienced slavery, their interactions with enslaved people was one of the things that made this such a memorable and historic event for them. And so, in reading through their experiences and sort of gleaning, or reading through these accounts and gleaning from them the experiences of enslaved people, this became one of the primary source bases that I used to write this book.
And Bennett, what would you like readers to take away from Somewhere Toward Freedom?
Yeah, so I think maybe two things. One is that I ultimately want readers to take away from Sherman's March the idea that while yes, this is a Civil War campaign, similar to Grant's Overland campaign, the Vicksburg campaign, etc., that this was one of those moments that changed the scope and the nature of what we imagine American freedom to be. And so, in that sense, yes, it is a military campaign, but it's similar to Gettysburg, maybe even a Selma, Alabama, Yorktown, right? It's one of these signature moments in American history that forced us as a people to really imagine what freedom meant. The other thing I think I would want readers to take away from it is just understanding this is a story by which enslaved people, people who have traditionally been at the margins of history, people who have otherwise become nameless and faceless in the historical record, nonetheless, by the sheer power of their collective movements, by running to the army in such large numbers, nonetheless changed the order of history, right? I mean, they forced Sherman to begin thinking about his own policies towards enslaved people, forced the government to acknowledge their presence. It led to something like Sherman's special field orders. And in doing so, they really acted politically. So it's a story by which people who, as I said, who have existed on the margins of history, who have been faceless and nameless in the historical record, nonetheless, really changed history.
What is next for you in your writing?
So I'm currently working on a book about Sherman himself. It's a biography, draws heavily from his accounts with his brother. Many people don't know this, but Sherman's biological brother, John Sherman, was a U.S. Senator. He replaced Salmon Chase in 1861. He's a senator all throughout the Civil War. He'd later become Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of State, and they wrote countless numbers of letters between themselves. And so I'm working on a biographical story of Sherman that draws heavily on his correspondence with his brother as well as with his wife. Um, and so that's next for me is for digging into these Sherman letters.
You're spending a lot of time with Sherman. What are your, give me a few impressions about Sherman and maybe a couple of surprises.
Yeah, well, it's funny. It's not something I necessarily expected, but as research happens sometimes, and as writing happens, I spent so much time working on this first book that it led me to other questions and other source bases, and so that's just sort of how things work out. I mean, the one thing about Sherman that to me is most interesting is kind of the scope of his life and career. I mean, we know about the war itself. I mean, he's one of the Civil War's most famous generals. But this is someone who was also in California at a time when California was becoming what we know it today. He's actually the one of the handful of Army and government representatives who were in the room when the first specks of gold are brought to Monterey, California. He writes the report confirming that the gold rush is happening back. He sends that report back east. And then after the war, he goes on to play a leading role in the wars, the Native American wars of the West. He spends as much time in his career fighting Native Americans on the plains that he does Confederates in the South. And so that combined with his pre-war career in California and the gold rush makes Sherman, in my mind, as much a central character in the history and the making of the American West as in the American South. And so that's one of the things that I think I'm most kind of interested in probing and thinking about. Another thing about Sherman that's so interesting is just how quotable he is. We know it from the kind of apocryphal quotes about him saying war is hell, about him warning the mayor of Atlanta about how hard he can make war on the city. But these really only begin to scratch the surface of the kind of memorable quotes that he has feathered and layered throughout his correspondence. And the best I can tell is he meant them. He was a fairly no nonsense kind of person. It's how his mind worked. He imagined things in black and white, not necessarily shades of gray. And I think it served him well throughout his career. So it's been fun working on this project in part because there's so much material. There's so many quotes to pull from. And he's someone who kind of put it all out there on his sleeve for biographers and writers.
So more to come from Bennett Parten on Sherman, but you can enjoy this one now. It's a great book, Somewhere Toward Freedom, Sherman's March and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation. And the author is Bennett Parten. Bennett, thank you so much for joining me.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
And this is the Speaking of Writers podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to it. And actually, for the book, too, make sure you stop by one of your local bookstores, your indie bookstores. And if they don't have it, ask for it. Bennett Parten's Somewhere Toward Freedom, Sherman's March, and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation. I'm Steve Richards.